The first thing Elena noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the hush of a mountain resort wrapping itself around a winter evening, not the polite quiet of rich people eating expensive food. This silence had weight to it. It pressed down on the private dining room at the back of the Aldermore Lodge the way a storm presses down on a valley before it breaks open. Elena had worked enough dinner services to know the difference between a room that was calm and a room that was holding its breath. Before we continue, hit the subscribe button, like and comment where you are watching from. Thank you. She stood near the service entrance with a tray of water glasses balanced on one hand, watching the table in the far corner from the corner of her eye. Table 9. The private room. Booked 3 days ago under a company name she didn't recognize. 4 men in dark suits had arrived first, an hour before the reservation. They had walked every inch of the dining room slowly, deliberately, like men measuring a space. Then they had sat down and ordered nothing. Elena had told herself they were security. Billionaires always came with security. That was normal. But when Victor Hale walked in at 7:42 flanked by 2 of the suits, something cold moved through her chest. She knew his face from the news. The sharp jaw, the silver at his temples, the kind of composed expression that said this man had never once been caught off guard in public. Except right now something was wrong with that expression. It was too composed. Too careful. The way a man's face looks when he is using every muscle in it to hide something. Elena moved to the table. Smiled. Set down the menus. That was when she saw his wrists. His left hand rested on the tablecloth and the sleeve of his jacket had ridden up 1/2 inch. The skin beneath was dark, bruised in a way that looked fresh. Not one bruise. Several. The kind that comes from something tight and hard being pressed against skin for a long time. Rope maybe. Or a zip tie. Her smile did not waver. She asked if they wanted still or sparkling water. One of the suited men, broad across the shoulders, with pale eyes that moved too fast, answered for the table. So, no lemon. He watched her the whole time she wrote it down. She walked back to the service station. Her hands were steady. He did not know how. When she came back with the water, Victor Hale dropped his napkin. It was a casual thing. Graceful even. He reached down to retrieve it from the floor and his fingers moved against the wooden leg of the table. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short, before he straightened up and set the napkin across his lap without ever looking at her. Elena poured the water. She walked back to the service station. She stood very still for a moment, staring at the shelf of bread baskets, and felt the floor tilt very slightly under her feet. Face. He had tapped SOS on the table leg. Victor Hale, one of the 12 wealthiest men in the world, whose face appeared on the covers of financial magazines, who had shaken hands with 3 sitting presidents, was sitting in the private dining room of the Aldermore Lodge in the mountains of northern Colorado, surrounded by armed men, and he had just tapped SOS on the table leg with his fingers. Elena breathed in once through her nose, out through her mouth. She looked at the room, the other dining tables, the bar, the front desk visible through the archway. There were 11 other guests in the lodge tonight. A couple from Chicago celebrating an anniversary. A retired judge and his wife. 2 men Elena didn't know who had checked in that afternoon. The lodge manager Carl was somewhere in the back office. 2 other waitstaff were on shift. Marcus, who was 22 and new, and Diane, who was 53 and had worked here longer than anyone. Elena looked at the front door. One of the suited men was standing near it. Not outside it. Near it. Close enough to reach the handle in 2 steps. She looked at the bar. Another suited man sat on a stool nursing a glass of water, turned so his back was to the bar and his eyes had the whole room. She looked at the desk near the service entrance where the lodge's landline phone sat. Then she looked at the man closest to the service corridor, the one with pale eyes who had ordered still water with no lemon, and realized that if she walked toward that phone he would see her before she got to it. Her cell phone was in her locker in the staff room. She had put it there at the start of her shift the way she always did. House rules. She was cut off. They had come in first and walked every inch of the room, and now she understood why. They had not been measuring the space. They had been choosing positions. Elena picked up a bread basket and walked back to table 9. She set the bread down and recited the evening's specials in a calm, unhurried voice. The filet. The lamb. The sea bass with lemon caper sauce. Victor Hale listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes looking just slightly past her, the way a man looks when he is concentrating on something invisible. The pale-eyed man watched her from across the room. Elena finished the specials, asked if they had questions, and was told by the broad-shouldered suit that they would need another moment. She nodded and stepped back. Her father had taught her Morse code in the living room of their house in Amarillo when she was 9 years old. He was an amateur radio operator, one of the last of a dying breed, he always said with a grin, as if that was something to be proud of. He had tacked a chart of dots and dashes to the refrigerator and quizzed her every morning over breakfast. She had complained about it constantly. She had told her friends it was the most embarrassing thing a father had ever done to a child. She had forgotten most of it by the time she was 14. But not all of it. She picked up a clean side plate from the service station. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the small squeeze bottle of balsamic reduction that Diane used to decorate bread plates. A thin dark line of glaze that the lodge's head chef had once described, with great seriousness, as adding visual dynamism to the rustic bread presentation. Elena thought about her father and the chart on the refrigerator. She set the plate on her tray. She walked back to table 9 and placed the bread plate in front of Victor Hale with a small apology. She'd forgotten to bring it with the basket, she said, still smiling. The broad-shouldered suit glanced at it. The pale-eyed man across the room looked at it. Elena set it down and straightened up and walked back to the service station before anyone had a chance to think too hard about a perfectly ordinary bread plate. On the surface of the plate, drawn in thin lines of balsamic reduction, were the words, for anyone who knew how to read them. How many men? She waited. She brought out the soup course. She refilled the water glasses. She checked on the anniversary couple at table 4 and smiled when the husband made a joke about the wine list. She did all of it on autopilot while watching table 9 from the periphery of her vision, waiting for something to happen or someone to move or the whole fragile thing to collapse around her. Victor Hale ate his soup. Then very slowly, very naturally, he reached for the small dish of olives at the center of the table. He was the only one at the table eating olives. He took one, chewed it, set the pit at the edge of his plate. Then he moved 2 olives from the dish, rolling them casually with one finger into a slight arrangement on the tablecloth beside his bread plate. He glanced at his watch. He moved 1 more olive. He leaned back in his chair. Elena looked at the arrangement from 15 feet away. He had to look twice. Then she had to press her thumbnail into her palm hard enough to hurt, because she needed to stay steady and the numbers she was reading did not allow for steady. 4 inside. 2 outside. 1 police dirty. She went to the kitchen and stood with her back against the cold steel of the prep counter and stared at the ceiling for 10 seconds. Chef Marco asked if she was all right. She told him she had a headache coming on. He handed her 2 aspirin and a cup of water and she thanked him and went back out. 6 armed men. At least 1 corrupt officer somewhere in the local chain. The nearest town was 22 miles down a mountain road that would be treacherous in the storm that was building outside. Elena could hear the wind now, picking up against the lodge's timber walls. The nearest law enforcement was the Aldermore County Sheriff's Department, and if one of the officers there was already bought, calling the sheriff's line was exactly as dangerous as doing nothing. She had no phone. She had no exits. She had a squeeze bottle of balsamic reduction and a dead man's knowledge of Morse code. She went back to work. The main course arrived at 8:40. Elena carried Victor Hale's fillet to the table herself. She set it down with a practiced flourish, adjusted the placement of the plate very slightly, more than was necessary, her fingers moving quickly at the edge of the porcelain, and straightened up with a small nod. The pale-eyed man was watching her. She met his gaze for exactly the same amount of time she would have met any guest's gaze, smiled the same smile, and asked if they needed anything else for the moment. She walked back to the service station and poured herself a small glass of water and drank it. On the rim of Victor Hale's dinner plate, scratched in hairline grooves with the tine of a fork during the half-second she had adjusted its placement, were the words, "Why you? Why now?" She had not planned to ask that. She had planned to ask him if there was a way to signal someone in the lodge, or whether any of the other guests were safe contacts. But something else had driven the question. Because what she had seen in Victor Hale's eyes when she placed the plate in front of him was not just fear. There was something underneath the fear that she could not name. A heaviness. Like a man standing at the edge of something he had been expecting to reach for a long time. He ate the fillet slowly. Made conversation with the broad-shouldered suit about nothing. Flight schedules, a property in the Cayman Islands, the quality of Colorado beef. The suited man laughed at something. Victor Hale smiled at the appropriate moment. Then he reached for his knife and held it at the angle of a man cutting meat and drew the blade once, twice, 3 times against the white edge of the bread plate in the particular short rhythm Elena had been watching for all evening. Then again. Longer strokes. Then short. She read it from the service station, moving her lips very slightly, translating as he went. It took her longer than she wanted. She made mistakes and had to restart. Her heart was going too fast. When she had it, she stood very still for a moment. He had written, offshore account. 50 billion. They want codes. I will not give. $50 billion. A hidden offshore account. And Victor Hale, sitting in the private dining room of a mountain resort with armed men around him and a storm coming, was choosing to die rather than hand it over. Elena thought about that for a long moment. She thought about the bruises on his wrist. She thought about the pale-eyed man's quick, cold gaze. She thought about the 2 men outside in the dark in the storm. Then she thought about what her father had told her once, years after the Morse code lessons, when she was old enough to understand what he meant. That the most dangerous thing in any situation is not the threat in front of you but the one you haven't identified yet. She picked up her tray. She went back to work. The storm broke at 9:15. It came in the way mountain storms come, without much warning and all at once, a wall of wind and snow slamming the lodge hard enough to rattle the windows and send a thin whistle through every door frame. The lights flickered. In the dining room the candles guttered and jumped. Several guests looked up from their meals. The broad-shouldered suit said something quietly to the pale-eyed man. The pale-eyed man stood and walked toward the window and looked out at the dark. The lights went out at 9:22. Not all at once. First the main room dimmed, then flickered, then died. The backup generator kicked in 3 seconds later, but it only powered the emergency lights, strips of low amber glow along the baseboards, enough to keep people from walking into walls but not enough for much else. The dining room became a room of shadows and candlelight. In the commotion, guests calling out, Carl the manager hurrying from the back office, Marcus knocking over a tray of dessert glasses in the dark. Elena made her move. She walked directly to the service corridor. She had 12 seconds, maybe 15, before the pale-eyed man's eyes adjusted to the low light and he re-established his position. She walked past the landline phone, still dead, the power outage had killed it, and pushed through the door to the back hallway and found the small utility closet where the lodge kept its emergency equipment. She found a flashlight. She found the first aid kit. And she found, zip-tied to the back wall of the closet and still wearing his uniform jacket, the lodge's actual night security guard, unconscious but breathing. They had been here longer than she thought. She touched the man's neck. Pull steady. She pulled the gag from his mouth and felt his chest rise. He would live. She could not wake him. She had no way to cut the zip ties without a tool she didn't have. She looked at him for 2 seconds. 2 seconds she could not afford and made herself leave. She went back to the dining room. Her face showed nothing. Dessert was served at 9:50. Elena carried the plates herself. Her hands were steady. She did not understand why they were steady but she was grateful for it. She set the chocolate torte in front of the broad-shouldered suit. She set the creme brulee in front of the third suited man who had not spoken once all evening. She set the cheese plate in front of the fourth. She set a small plate of petit fours in front of Victor Hale. She adjusted it slightly as she set it down. Her fingers worked fast. She straightened up and walked back to the service station. On the edge of the petit fours plate, scratched in the same hairline grooves, guard found. Tie. Breathing. Cannot call out. What is plan? She watched Victor Hale receive the message. The only change in his face was the faintest tightening around the eyes. There and gone in under a second. He took a petit four. Chewed it. Set his dessert fork on the plate at an angle. Moved it slightly. Picked it up. Tapped the handle once against the plate edge. Set it down again. Elena read it twice to make sure she had it right. Midnight transport. Helicopter. They move me before storm clears. Need 10 minutes and distraction. Can you do? 10 minutes. A distraction. From a woman with no weapon, no phone, no help and 6 armed men between her and any workable exit. She thought about the utility closet. She thought about the emergency equipment. She thought about the backup generator in the basement that Carl had gone down to check on 10 minutes ago and hadn't come back from yet, which either meant the generator needed work or meant Carl was being kept out of the room for a reason. She thought about the fire suppression system. The Aldermore Lodge was an old building, refitted 10 years ago with a modern sprinkler system that was, according to the code compliance certificate framed on the wall of the staff break room, fully operational and tested annually. The system was triggered by heat sensors throughout the building. The sensors in the kitchen were set deliberately high. Industrial kitchens ran hot and you did not want the suppression system going off during a dinner service. But the sensors in the service corridor and the hallways were set to standard commercial levels. A flare from the emergency kit in the utility closet, held near a hallway sensor, would set off the entire system. It would flood the building with water. It would trigger the alarm. It would force an evacuation of every guest. And in the chaos of a fire alarm evacuation in the middle of a mountain storm, 6 armed men trying to keep track of a hostage and maintain their positions would have approximately 10 seconds before everything fell apart. Elena looked across the dining room at Victor Hale. He gave him nothing. No nod, no signal. She simply cleared a nearby table and walked back to the service station and set down her tray and checked her watch. 9:58. She had 2 minutes before she needed to move. She used one of them standing perfectly still, looking at nothing, breathing slowly, thinking through every step of what she was about to do and all the ways it could end badly. Then she used the other minute walking to the utility closet. She had the flare in her hand and was already moving back toward the hallway sensor when the pale-eyed man stepped out of the shadows behind her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply held out his hand. Elena looked at the flare. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face, those pale, fast-moving eyes now very still, very focused. And she understood that this man had been watching her all evening with exactly the right kind of attention and that she had not been as invisible as she thought. "Serving mistake," she said. Her voice was flat. "Steady. I thought it was a candle." He looked at the flare. He looked at her. "Step back inside," he said. She did. The dining room felt smaller when she walked back into it. The candles had burned lower. The amber emergency lighting made everyone look like they were lit from below. The anniversary couple had moved to the bar, holding hands across the counter. The retired judge was on his feet near the window. Marcus was somewhere in the back. Diane was behind the bar, polishing a glass with the methodical calm of a woman who had decided that staying useful was the best way to stay safe. Elena walked to the service station. The pale-eyed man resumed his position near the service corridor entrance. He had not said anything to the broad-shouldered suit. He had not raised an alarm. He was watching to see what she would do next. That was interesting. That meant he wasn't certain yet. He had found her with a flare but not with a plate covered in Morse code. He knew she was doing something. He didn't know what. She had maybe 5 minutes before midnight transport. She picked up a clean dessert plate. He picked up the balsamic reduction. She worked quickly, not looking at what she was writing because looking would slow her down and slow was death right now. She loaded the plate onto her tray and walked back toward table 9. The broad-shouldered suit glanced at her as she approached. "Complimentary dessert plate," she said. "Chef, apologies for the power interruption." She set the plate in front of Victor Hale. On it, in thin dark lines of balsamic reduction, were the words, "Fire plan blocked. No exit. I am sorry." She watched him read it. She watched his face. She watched the heavy, resigned look she had seen earlier settle deeper into his eyes. And for the first time all evening, Elena felt something that was not fear and not adrenaline. It was a pulling grief for a man choosing to absorb something terrible rather than let it pass through him to someone else. Victor Hale picked up his dessert fork. He held it for a moment over the balsamic plate. She thought he was going to write a response. Then he set it down. He looked up at her. Just once, directly, in a way none of the suited men would catch the meaning of, and what she saw in his eyes was not defeat. It was a warning. He looked down at the plate. He looked up once more quickly toward the far end of the private dining room. Toward the table in the corner, the one Elena had almost forgotten about, where a single man had sat quietly all evening eating alone, barely touching his food, not part of Victor's group but not clearly separate either. A thin man with rimless glasses and a gray sweater, who had checked in that afternoon and given his name as something forgettable and had asked for a corner table with his back to the wall. Elena looked at the thin man. The thin man looked at his plate. And then Victor Hale's fork moved. Fast this time. Urgent. Short strokes, long strokes, short. She read it as he wrote it and her stomach dropped through the floor. "The traitor is at table." She stared at the thin man in the gray sweater. He was not eating. He was watching. Watching Victor. Watching the suits. Watching the door. His hands were below the tablecloth and very still. Someone inside the lodge was feeding the kidnappers information. Someone who could move freely, who would not be stopped at the door, who could walk through the dining room without attracting the kind of attention that men with guns attract. One of the guests. The thin man looked up. He looked directly at Elena. She smiled at him. Automatic. Professional. The smile of a woman who saw nothing. She walked back to the service station. Her heart was going so fast she could feel it in her teeth. 10:57. 3 minutes to midnight. Elena stood at the service station and looked at the dining room and tried to make a plan out of pieces that didn't fit together. Victor had given her a warning. The traitor at the table had made eye contact. The pale-eyed man was still watching her from near the corridor entrance. Outside, the storm was a wall of noise and snow. Somewhere below, the helicopter was warming up, or would be soon. She thought about the security guard in the closet. Breathing but unconscious. She thought about Carl in the basement. She thought about Marcus, who was 22 and new and had no idea what was happening. She thought about Diane polishing glasses behind the bar with quiet, deliberate calm. Elena looked at Diane. Diane looked back at her. And something passed between them. Not words, not signals, just the silent recognition that passes between two people who have been paying attention to the same room all evening and have both arrived at the same terrible understanding. Diane set down her glass. She walked to the other end of the bar. She bent down as if reaching for something below the counter. She came up with a small laminated card. The emergency procedures card that every lodge in the state was required by law to post in a visible location behind the bar. And she set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Elena. The card listed the fire suppression trigger panel location. Staff use only. Basement utility room. Elena felt something open up in her chest. Carl was in the basement. Carl, who had not come back from checking the generator. Carl, who knew every inch of this building, including the location of the fire suppression trigger panel, which could be set off manually without a flare, without a heat sensor, without anything except a key that the lodge manager kept on his keyring. He had 3 minutes. She looked at the pale-eyed man near the corridor entrance. He was watching her. She would not get past him to the basement stairs. She looked at the thin man in the gray sweater. He was still watching the room. She looked at the broad-shouldered suit at table 9. And then she looked at Victor Hale, who was looking at her, and she made a decision she could not take back. She picked up the last dinner plate from the service station. The final plate of the evening. A small courtesy plate she had been arranging for the last 30 minutes, setting it aside, coming back to it, adjusting it. She loaded it onto her tray. She walked toward the private dining room. The broad-shouldered suit watched her come. "Last course," she said. "Compliments of the lodge." She set the plate in front of Victor Hale and turned to leave. She was 2 steps from the table when she felt it. The slight imbalance of a tray that was not quite right, a plate that had shifted during the walk. She looked down. The plate on her tray. The one she had not loaded herself. There was a message scratched into the underside of it, visible now as the tray tilted, in the same hairline groove she had been carving all evening. She recognized the technique because she had invented it in this room 2 hours ago. The letters were shaky but readable. "Don't trust Victor." Elena stood absolutely still. He did not look at Victor. She did not look at the thin man in the gray sweater. She did not look at the pale-eyed man or the broad-shouldered suit or anyone. She looked at the plate. Someone in this room had gotten close enough to her tray to scratch a message into the underside of a plate and return it to the stack at the service station without her noticing. Someone who had been watching her all evening with enough understanding of what she was doing to use her own method against her. Someone who had something to gain from making her doubt the only man in the room who had asked for her help. Elena turned the tray slowly. She looked at Victor Hale. He was watching her. His expression was unreadable. His bruised wrist rested on the table. He looked like a man who had been waiting a very long time to see which way a coin would fall. In the corner, the thin man in the gray sweater rose from his seat. Outside, the storm pressed hard against the mountain. Somewhere below, the sound of a helicopter engine beginning to turn. Elena stood between the service station and table 9 with a dinner plate in her hands and a message scratched into its underside, and she understood with absolute clarity that the next decision she made would determine what happened to Victor Hale, what happened to everyone in this room, and what happened to her. She had 10 seconds. Maybe less. She looked at the plate one more time. 3 words. Don't trust Victor. She looked at the man who had tapped SOS on a table leg with his bruised fingers and spent an entire dinner writing to her in a dead language across the surface of expensive porcelain. She made her choice. She walked forward. To be continued.